Welcome to an interview with author Daniela Melo about her article in Foreign Policy Analysis on Outmaneuvering Kissinger, Role Theory, U.S. Intra-Elite Conflict, and the Portuguese Revolution. Professor Melo is a faculty member at Connecticut College, and her research interests include role theory, social movements, state feminism and gender policy, and regime transitions and democratization.
So in this article, I use role theory in order to examine what happens when elites disagree. Specifically, when US elites disagree about the national role conceptions that shape foreign policy, or that should shape foreign policy in the United States. And I'm particularly interested in the question from actually two points of view, right? How does this disagreement over national role conceptions emerge? And how is this disagreement eventually resolved, right? And once resolved, transforms into a new national role conception that delivers a coherent foreign policy from the United States towards other states. So in order to investigate this question, for this particular article, I decided to focus on the case study of US foreign policy towards the Portuguese Revolution. Now, the Portuguese Revolution happened between 1974 and 1976. And this is a really, really interesting case, a very prolific, fruitful case to examine role competition amongst elites and to examine the resolution, right, of that role. So one of the things that happens in 1974 is, actually, let me take a step back. So up until 1974, the Portuguese and the United States, the Portuguese state and the United States have a fairly stable relationship. So in spite of the fact that Portugal is a dictatorship through most of the 20th century, Portugal is a founding member of NATO. The dictatorship is itself an ally of the West and an ally of the United States in the fight against communism. And I generally classify, for a variety of other reasons as well, the national role conceptions of the United States towards the Portuguese state up to 1974 as one of strong allyship. They're strong allies. All of this comes into play in 1974, and when the Portuguese, or segments of the Portuguese military, I should say, launch a coup against the dictatorship, and that coup eventually unleashes a revolutionary process that lasts for 2 years. So a stable relationship up until 1974 really becomes a lot more unstable because of the uncertainty of what is going to happen with the transitional governments within Portugal. What is going to happen now that there's a very left-leaning, left-wing military revolution, military-led revolution, I should say, and what's going to happen when communists, what's going to happen now that communists are part of the transitional government? Basically, one of the key questions that the State Department, that the US administration at the time is asking is, can we actually maintain a state like Portugal that seems to be going communist, or at least very far left, as a member of the Western Alliance, as a member of NATO, or should we turn our backs to Portugal and turn them into an example to any other states that might be considering a similar path, or that might be considering allowing communists to take a relevant role in politics and in the government in particular. So this is also a very interesting period in the United States. In the United States, we have just gone through Watergate in the middle of the Portuguese Revolution. Nixon resigns. We have Ford taking his place, so we have a transition at the highest level of our executive office between Nixon and Ford. And during this period, the Secretary of State is Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger is really one of the main focus of my article, because he is in this privileged position during this particular period to be the top role entrepreneur in terms of how the United States is defining its role conceptions towards Portugal during this period. And Henry Kissinger increasingly takes a hard view of what's happening in Portugal. So between 1974 and 1975, he becomes convinced that his ambassador in Lisbon is misreading the situation, because Ambassador Scott in 1974 from Lisbon is fairly confident that the moderates are going to get a grip on the revolution. Kissinger, on the other hand, increasingly starts comparing the Portuguese Revolution in his own mind to perhaps Russia. He sees the moderates as being weak. He sees the communists, the radicals, as gaining more ground very quickly and eventually transforming Portugal into a communist state. So one of the things that he decides to do is, let's replace the ambassador, right? So he resolves the conflict between national role conceptions between Ambassador Scott and himself by firing Ambassador Scott effectively and replacing him with Frank Carlucci. The problem, of course, is that, well, perhaps not of course, but the problem is that Frank Carlucci agrees more with the role conceptions that Scott had been offering than with Kissinger's. So what's really interesting about this case is you have a very clear case of role competition and disagreement between the Secretary of State and between his two ambassadors. What's most surprising about the case, in my opinion, is that the resolution of that conflict really ends up favoring Carlucci. So Carlucci manages to, as the title of my article sort of points out, outmaneuver Kissinger in order to have his national role conception of how the United States should treat Portugal be the one that becomes the national role conception of the United States towards Portugal. So Carlucci is pushing for a strong ally role. Carlucci is pushing for Portugal to, for the United States to continue to provide aid to Portugal, support to the moderates. He is convinced that the moderates have a very strong chance of taking hold of the revolution, and this clearly clashes with Kissinger's behavior and statements during the period as well. So one of the findings that my article focuses on, or one of the interesting findings, is that the main mechanism that Carlucci utilizes in order to outmaneuver Kissinger and have his role conception prevail is the use of back channels and informal access to various other players within the US administration. I name many of these, but one of the most important ones is that Carlucci, in the summer of 1975, contacts his friend, Donald Rumsfeld, who at the time is the chief of staff to President Ford, and tries to leverage his other venues of access to the presidency, right, into a meeting with Kissinger, in which Kissinger eventually agrees that they will try out Carlucci's strategy, and that eventually becomes the strategy, the foreign policy approach of the United States from that point on towards Portugal. This is, of course, a much more complex picture that I'm painting here, but that's what the article's for, right? This is a very interesting question. I think it is safe to say for any student of US foreign policy that this is definitely a period in the United States in which we clearly see a lot of role contestation between different elite groups. And that contestation, the sources of that contestation, I'll leave for my colleagues to, and for myself perhaps, to investigate later on. But it is very clear that we have multiple examples of intra-elite contestation between the executive office and Congress, between the executive office and state agencies like intelligence agencies, and that this is clearly having an effect on the role enactment of US foreign policy abroad. So, I mean, a couple of examples come to mind immediately from this summer. So most clearly, following Helsinki, we have seen Congress in particular, and even some elements of the administration disagree with the position that the president has taken towards Russia. And, you know, we can clearly see that the executive office and Congress are disagreeing about whether or not Russia should be considered a strong ally of the United States, or could be considered a strong ally of the United States, or whether or not we should proceed with role enactments that classify Russia, or that provide Russia with an identity that is closer to that of an enemy, or at least that indicate that we should be very cautious in our treatment of Russia and engagement with Russia. It is hard to predict how that conflict, right, is going to play out in the long term. But nonetheless, this is going to be a period in which I would imagine this is a period that role theorists should definitely pay a lot of attention to, because we have a lot of opportunities, at least from a theoretical standpoint, to really truly examine the various paths that the resolution of conflict, right, within an administration, particularly conflict that has a very direct impact on foreign policy enactments, can take. So I talked about one type of outcome in which back channels are very, very important, but there are multiple other possibilities in terms of how different elites leverage their influence and use back channels, perhaps even use the media, popular opinion, etc., to leverage against each other, right, and to have their national role conceptions prevail. A second example that comes to mind, and I won't spend as much time on this one, is we clearly see as well an emerging conflict about the role that the United States should have, should continue to enact towards the European Union. So on one camp, we have individuals who are, and elements of the administration who are skeptical about the need of continuing a relationship of alliance, a strong alliance with the European Union, be it a security alliance or an economic alliance. And on another camp, we very clearly have individuals, agencies, etc., who want to continue the same types of role enactments that we've had for several decades with the European Union at this point. So will the European Union continue to be a friend, or will it be a foe? That's another question, again, that I think role theorists will be very interested in continuing to pursue. And again, more fruitful ground for us to theorize the multiple paths that national role conceptions and their resolution really come into being.